if there's any like 10-year-olds listening to this podcast, it's always funny. I have to mark on YouTube when I publish these things. They say, "Is it for kids?" And I'm always like, "It's not for kids."
Right.
But I doubt that our primary audience is children. So if there's any 10-year-olds out there listening, like, good on you. You could be the next Linus Torvalds. Hey there, welcome to Book Overflows, the podcast for software engineers by software engineers, where every week we read one of the best technical books in the world in an effort to improve our craft. I am Carter Morgan, and I'm joined here, as always, by my co-host, Nathan Toups. How are you doing, Nathan?
Doing great. Hey, everybody.
Nathan has pointed out in previous episodes that his doing great, hey, everybody, is sometimes getting edited out or silent. I'm looking into that. We don't know why, but I want the audience to know that Nathan, in the past few episodes, has still been doing great, hey, everybody, and he is not ghosting you. Just to be mean.
Yeah, I was waiting for some rage to show up in the comments, but
yeah. Well, hey, and speaking of comments, like, comment, subscribe wherever you're at. We appreciate hearing from you guys. Share the podcast with friends and coworkers. Share it in Slack. Share it on LinkedIn. And I meant to mention this a couple episodes ago, but we passed 50 discussion episodes recently, which I thought was a pretty cool milestone. We love doing the interviews, and we know how much you guys love the interviews. To a certain extent, we don't have as much control over that. It's just whenever people agree to being interviewed. But we do have control over the discussion episode. So I don't know. What do you think, Nathan? I think passing 50 is a pretty cool marker.
Yeah, right. I think what most YouTube channels like struggle to get past 3 videos. I think the real benchmark, I think, will be when we hit 100. So we're halfway there. That'll be really cool, because I think that just shows that we're dedicated in pushing forward on it. It'll also be interesting to see how this evolves over time. I think, this,
like all content evolution, it will be a series of short form videos.
Yes. Eventually, we're just going to embrace the short form overlords and just give you a very frantic 30-second review of books.
Our podcast editing software will create short form clips for you, and also will convert them into AI art styles, and it was do a Muppet version, and I was like, oh, maybe that would be fun. I was like, maybe it'd be fun just to show that to the listeners. I sent it to you, Nathan. It's nightmare fuel.
Yeah. So the freakiest part was it was it. First of all, it did a pretty good job, I think, of getting a Muppet-esque thing, except it used real human teeth, and that was the nightmare part. I was like, okay, cool Muppet, and then I'm like, those teeth. No way. Mm-mm.
Release the Muppet cut.
Yeah.
And I wanted to mention a fun experience with the podcast I had recently. I was texting you about this, Nathan, but in detail, my CEO at my new startup, he's been trying to recruit some software engineers, and especially he's looking at integrating more live streaming into the platform. So there's some software engineers from Twitch in Utah, and he's like, well, maybe it'd be nice to recruit these guys, or at the very least talk to them and just find out more about live streaming. And so he messages a couple of them. One of them writes back to him, and he's like, you're from Leland? He's like, I know you guys. One of the hosts of a podcast I like just joined you, right? He's like, yeah, Carter. He just came on. He just joined the team, and he's like, sure, I'd love to come in. And and then he came in obviously just to network, but then he was like, and it'd be cool to meet Carter too. And so my boss came to me, and I was deployed as the celebrity host for the lunch. Yeah, and so Trent, if you're out there listening, lovely meeting you, and so fun to talk with another software engineer here in Utah, and someone who's listened to the podcast before. And something Trent said, this kind of loops back into the 50 discussion episodes. He said that when he found our podcast, he was so this sounds interesting, And then he was also pleased when he got into the backlog, because he just recently found it a month or two ago. He said so many podcasts you'll find that sound interesting. You see they have 2 episodes. They record one episode, a month later they record an episode. 6 months later, there's an episode explaining why they haven't been recording for the past 6 months. And so he was just like, not only does this sound interesting, he's like, you guys are actually doing it. You actually do release a new discussion episode each week. And so, that's been important to us as podcast creators here. And so it was nice to hear someone appreciate it in person, but obviously we know you guys appreciate it because we see the viewership numbers. So thanks everyone for sticking around. And we're excited to bring you yet another discussion episode. This one, is a little outside of what we do. And if we're just being totally honest up front, we have been fortunate to interview a lot of really interesting people over the podcast. And this is kind of us trying to get a white whale interview, because this week we are reading Linus Torvalds' book. Linus Torvalds is famously the inventor of Linux. And we know that's kind of a big get if we could get him on the podcast. But we figured, you know what? The only way we're going to even have a shot of getting him on the podcast is if we read something he wrote. And so we took a chance, read this book, and I guess we'll introduce the book and then get into impressions, because we're very glad we read this book. It was awesome.
Yeah, amazing book.
We'll introduce the authors in the book. Linus Torvalds, again, you know him, but he created Linux in 1991 as a 21-year-old Finnish student, accidentally launching the open source revolution from his Helsinki bedroom. He continues to oversee Linux development from Portland, Oregon, maintaining the operating system that now powers billions of devices worldwide. Is he in Portland now?
He's in Portland now. Yeah, the book. He's still in Silicon Valley in the book, but yeah, I think if I remember correctly, it's like I'm gonna sound like a weird freak of a nerd here, but I think it was around like 2004, 2005, like right before he did Get. Actually, he moved up to Portland.
He moved to Portland. That's crazy. I grew up in like literally across the street from him. Then I was in Vancouver, across the river.
You had no idea that this super guru of focus and clarity and community building was right around the corner.
I should have said hi. And then it is co-authored, and I get the impression perhaps ghost-written by David Diamond. I don't know. Is the book explicit about that?
No, I mean, I don't know either. I have read other. If it was, it kept the voice of Torvalds really well, because there's a lot of writing from his emails that are very famous sometimes. And so I definitely got the personality. But yeah, we should dive into it, because I would love, that'd be a question I would love to ask Linus. That would be cool.
I don't know. And if it is ghost written, I don't mean that as a slight. Linus is an incredibly busy guy, and if it was ghost written, like you said, it absolutely preserves Linus's voice. So we're not claiming it's ghost written, but it is a strong partnership with David Diamond. There's interviews kind of with him throughout, who is a veteran technology journalist who covered Silicon Valley for the New York Times, Wired, and as executive editor of Red Herring. His irreverent style and ability to translate geek speak made him the perfect co-author for Torvalds' story. Right. And this book is just for fun. It is written in 2001, and so there is a lot that is not mentioned in it. And just so you kind of know, as we discussed, the story does end in 2001 here, but it tells how Linus Torvalds accidentally revolutionized software by creating Linux as a hobby project in his bedroom. With self-deprecating humor, Torvalds chronicles his story from antisocial Finnish nerd to reluctant tech celebrity, while sharing his theory that everything in life revolves from survival to social order to entertainment. It's a refreshingly honest tech memoir by someone who insists he wasn't trying to change the world. He was just having fun. So pretty straightforward. It's the story of Linux, ends in 2001. Very interesting. I think a lot of us are familiar with, obviously we all know what Linux is, but getting an in-depth chronicle of it was fascinating. I don't know. What do you think, Nathan? How do you enjoy the book?
Yeah, so this book was interesting because it was kind of written in this alternative style as well. It didn't try to go in and just write a memoir. It wasn't just Linus's philosophy. It was kind of a mix. I thought this book had a fantastic sense of humor. I felt very engaged. I would put it in the same category as Unix, A History and Memoir by Brian Kernighan. So if you've read that along with us, you should definitely check this book out, right? Like you'll hear that in more of the recommendations later. But I really liked the pacing of this book. And again, maybe this is some influence from David Diamond. But it oscillated from a complete, like a straight up memoir where you would learn about Linus's life, which a lot of these details I'd never heard before. And then kind of inject some philosophy. And then also really talk about the very present moment of him experiencing things like the Red Hat IPO that happens in this book, right? He goes from basically being in this like super cheap condo on a junior engineer salary to being a multimillionaire by the end of the book. And it's fascinating glimpse because we're seeing the first 10 years and then another 25 years has gone by, and it's just gone everything that there's a lot of things he predicted that ended up becoming true tenfold. And then there's some things that he predicted that didn't turn out to be true. And I think it'll be cool to talk about this as we go through the book and the predictions that he made. Which he says, I'm terrible at predictions, so don't like take any of this I say with a grain of salt, which I thought again was very like pragmatic. I think pragmatic is maybe the theme of this book.
Yeah, that was a big takeaway for me as well, that I, of course, am familiar with Linus's work, but have not read a ton from him or seen a ton of interviews from him. And he kind of talks about this in the book, where he's like, people meet me and they kind of expect me to be kind of like this pure noble monk, like a warrior for the open source movement or whatever. But like, he's not. Like, in a lot of ways, he's as self-interested as the rest of us. He's very funny, which I did not expect at all. I have several highlights from the book, but I just highlighted, not because I found them insightful, because they made me laugh. And I want to make sure I share some of them over the course of the podcast. Yeah. And I'll say with this book, just by nature, I did not do, I was not as up to date with my reading as I should have been. And so like Tuesday night, before we recorded, like I had like 200 pages left of this book. And I was like, I just kind of cleared my schedule. I'm like, I'm just going to read this book. And like, the book will not be named, but that has happened one other time with this podcast. And that was awful, because it was just like a really deep technical book. And I was just like slogging through this. Not this at all. Like, this was a really enjoyable, pleasant read. Like, it was great. It was a great way to spend a night. You can read this book in like a night or two. And yeah, it flows really well. Really fascinating subject and a great read.
Yep, I'm also a slow reader, and I was able to get it done in a week, so it really wasn't bad.
No one on this podcast is going to believe you're a slow reader, Nathan.
Oh, I know. It's funny. I'm like 99% sure I have undiagnosed dyslexia, so I've come up with all kinds of creative tricks, which is something that dyslexic folks do. But making time is one of those tricks. So that's just what you got to do.
Well, let's talk about it. I mean, I guess it probably makes sense to talk about his kind of opening theory. We talked about it at the top, but let's be more explicit about it. Kind of starts with his theory of life, which he says everything progresses through 3 stages: survival, to social order, to entertainment. And that's kind of the thesis of the book. The book is called Just for Fun.
Right.
And I think that's an important strain throughout the book. When he starts developing Linux, there isn't really a purpose for him developing Linux. It's not even like he sees a big gap in the market. Like, oh my gosh, this is what the world needs. Like, he starts it just for fun. Like,
yeah.
And so I don't know, any thoughts about kind of that theory?
I thought this was kind of cool. I mean, it's funny because, you see this rise of the nerds before it was obvious that nerds sort of like owned the future in tech, right? He was born in 1969, so he's only 9 years younger than my mother and father. He's actually almost exactly 10 years younger than my father. And what's interesting about this is that he was old enough to get into early computing. And by early computing, I mean like you had to have basically a family member who was really into it. And so he was talking about how like his grandfather introduced him to the Commodore VIC-20. And of course, anybody who might look at enthusiast stuff realize like what a constrained environment this was, right? Yeah. And it was back in the days when you would like get in magazines and just like copy the code that was like, in a magazine to like play a game. And I think it was one of those things where like you either got the bug or you didn't, right? You either were like, oh my gosh, this is what I want to do. This is like all I want to, how I'm gonna spend my time. And they even I loved this. They made a joke of like how his mother could just like put him in a closet with a computer and just feed him, and that was like all it took. And so if you see this, like that's his idea of fun, right? Which again, I think a lot of people that would not be their idea of fun. But when he dove into this theory of life, I thought this was interesting because yes, he starts with survival, social order, and entertainment. He also defines these really well, right? So I think he basically is like, it's kind of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, except fun is at the top of the chart of self-actualization. And but he basically says like you can't, like if you're in survival mode, if you can't feed yourself, if you can't do these things, like you can't go to the next one, right? You can't go to social order, in which I think in his sense he really defines as like having that safety, the social safety that I can walk down the street and not get mugged, right? Like these other kind of things. It's a step above survival, but it's this idea that there is a fabric of, you know, human existence that's in place. And then once you have this problems sort of solved, you're kind of looking around and being like, well, how do I entertain myself? And I also think that each one of these layers can be subverted. And I don't think it was he already criticizes like how people are obsessed with technology. Like he talks about how you know, texting and some of these other things are already like starting to emerge in 2001, especially in Finland. I don't think he had the idea of like how addictive stuff could be.
Yeah.
Because I do think that like I think it is incredibly important to find the entertainment, but I also think that you can entertain yourself to death, right? Like I think if you just doom scroll TikTok, you're fulfilling that need of wanting to entertain yourself, but you're not doing it in a way that like builds Linux or creates Git or does something deeply creative where you wake up the next day and go, I have a purpose. I'm so excited about working on this thing next. Instead of you're like, I'm consuming entertainment and I can't stop, right? Which I think is like, unfortunately, there's a dark side to all three of these. And so I don't know, we'll get into a lot of this stuff, but like this book made me think a lot, which is great. Cause I also thought about, you know, if I watch, you know, the news, if I watch MSNBC or CNN or Fox or something, and I've been convinced that my survival is on the line, right?
Sure.
Worrying about immigration or wars or whatever. I can't really do things like social order and entertainment if my lizard brain goes all the way down to survival mode. Right?
Yeah.
I think that these are the kind of things where you kind of see that Linus figured out a way to structure his life so that he could work on what was the most interesting to him. And it goes, we should get into this over the episode. There's a few times in this book where he walks away from fame and fortune several times. There was one time, I think it was like somebody offered him like $10 million to be the spokesperson. This is when he didn't have a bunch of money. Yeah. And he was just like, no, why would I do that?
It wasn't even the spokesperson. It was $10 million to be a board member.
That's right.
Of like this guy's Linux company. And he was like, nah, not interested. And the guy kind of had to like explain to him. He was like, you understand this is $10 million for nothing, right? And Linus was just like, no, like I don't want to do it. And I found that impressive because like
his character.
I don't consider I'm not like someone who's like, oh, I'm going to sell out to whoever. But I'm like, but I found that impressive because it's just like, that lines up pretty well with Linus, right? Like he invented Linux, like it's a board seat, so it's not like he has to go out and say like this is the greatest thing that ever was invented, right? And still turns it down just because to him he's like, I don't know, that's not really what I want to do with my life. And as someone who has made choices in the past that maybe weren't exactly like optimized for how much fun I wanted to have or what I wanted to do, what I wanted out of my life, but because there was good money involved, like it did make me think like, oh, interesting. Like, I don't know if I would have made that same decision.
Right.
And Linus might be right here.
I think so. I think it's one of the aspects of his character that makes him exceptional. I thought was one of the interesting things is that he was really uncomfortable with the term benevolent dictator for life, which is a term that was used like in the Python community. And there's several other places where, you know, it's sort of a cult of personality, this one person who kind of like starts this project and then kind of naturally becomes the leader. Linus has done this de facto, and he actually even makes a joke like towards the end of the book. He's like, look, one day I could wake up and like, you know, put, you know, basically act like you know, death metal rocker or something and say really crazy things. And all you have to do is fork the project, right? All you have to do is be like, hey, he's not of the mind to do this anymore. We're just going to take all the open source code and like go do our own thing. And so he's there because people trust him to make the best decisions, which is why he is still the leader. And he's had longevity with this. And I think that that's really interesting is that there's no force or coercion, right? We talk in politics, like libertarians will talk about this. And I think this is like a very natural way of showing that this, you know, single leader without having some, you know, democratic structures in place has credibility due to his behavior, not because he's forcing people to do it a certain way. And I was actually looking to see if there's other examples of someone who's been successful. And honestly, no one to his degree. I think he's absolutely unique in that the project is a success. It solves a problem that was a real problem. Like from a product focused standpoint, it's probably the most successful software project in human history. If you measure it by ubiquity of its user base, of where is operating system used and what type of problem does it solve, and it took this pain that was in the industry where Unix could never quite get on the same page of what it needed to do for commercial applications. Microsoft was using awful licensing. Oracle was using awful licensing. So was IBM. And everyone hated that they were kind of stuck on these tools. And he gave a way for a group of geeks to move faster, build more reliable software, and move at a scale that couldn't be competed with by a single corporation. This really, like, I don't think it all clicked to me. Like, I think some of this was like, oh yeah, well, Linux is awesome. But it didn't strike me of like how effective of a leader he was without actually being a leader. That's the other thing. Like, we can get into this book, but like, he tried to be a manager at one of the companies that he was at, and he did a terrible job.
Yeah.
And he like talks about this. And anyway, I don't know. I know that we're all over the map for this episode, but I think we will be because this book was too.
Linus is an interesting guy. I think it's funny you say like it's the most successful software project in history, and that gets me thinking. I'm like, are there any other more successful software projects? And immediately I'm like, oh, Git. I'm like, wait, Linus invented that too.
Right.
And this book does end before Git is invented.
Yeah, that's another fascinating thing. And it wasn't even like there wasn't even a hint at it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And it was really interesting. It was like the other thing that I think is interesting about this book and is how quickly he will develop proof of concept software and just get it in front of people. So he felt like he's kind of dragging his feet, but he built Linux in a very short window of time. He also kind of did something that I think it was interesting. It was like there's like this idea of like kill your masters or kill the Buddha is like a term that's been used to kind of say like, hey, the people that you worship, you may one day realize that they're not worth that. And he reads this operating systems book that kind of like blows his mind, right? It's like he talks about like, hey, everyone has that one book that you read that kind of like changes the trajectory of your thinking. And he read this operating systems book, and one of the co-authors was the creator of Minix. And it was really interesting to see that like where he got his initial following was actually in the Minix news groups. And the creator of Minix hated Linux.
Oh yeah,
absolutely hated it. This is probably one of the first like flame wars that ends up happening around this. And I didn't know the details of this. I knew that he created Linux because Minix was complicated. Like I remember knowing that a little bit, but he really gets into the details of like why architecturally Linux ended up winning and Minix had these problems. And so yeah, anyway, like I'm sure we'll get into the details of some of this, but I don't know. I came out of this book with a deep appreciation of the sort of humble beginnings of Linux.
Well, and maybe let's talk about some of those humble beginnings, because I found this very interesting because this book goes into Linus's early childhood. And yeah, some interesting things here. One, I'd like to say throughout the book, he describes himself as ugly, and he talks about how big his nose is. And maybe it's just because he set that up. I hadn't seen a picture of Linus in a while. I looked it up. Linus, you're being too hard on yourself. You're a good looking guy, right? Like the nose isn't that big. So I think one, Linus, take it easy. Two,
he also says he grew into it though. So maybe
that's what happened.
Because sometimes people can have that sort of ugly duckly, awkward, early teenage years. True. But who knows?
Yeah. You look good as an adult, Linus. Anyhow, but so his upbringing is interesting because there's a couple of things I find interesting about him. One, it's the most obvious thing. He's from Finland, right? Obviously, the beating heart of the software world is the Bay Area. And yet, kind of the biggest, most revolutionary piece of, easily the biggest, most revolutionary piece of open source software. But like you said, Nathan, I mean, Linux is seeing huge adoption in professional capacities. It originates out of Finland. And I think even more interesting out of Finland is sometimes like sometimes I'll be a little discouraged reading about like some of the quote unquote great figures in our industry, like your Bill Gates or your Mark Zuckerberg, and you're kind of like, okay, well, what were they like? And it's like, well, Bill Gates, his mom worked at the local university, and so she had access to like these computer labs, and so that's kind of how he got started, right? Or it's like Mark Zuckerberg, it's like, well, his dad was a very he lived in kind of like near New York City, and his dad I think was like a very successful dentist, and so they had like a lot of money, and so sometimes it makes you feel like, oh man, like maybe whether or not you're truly great kind of begins at a very young age, and if you weren't born in the right set of circumstances, maybe you can't. Linus, I mean, he is the children of journalists, and he's explicit about this, communists, right?
Yeah,
like
his
a lot
father
of his
was a
family are like,
straight up communist. Yeah.
like a straight up communist. Linus does not subscribe to that ideology really at all. They live in, they're in Finland, which is not a very wealthy nation when Linus is growing up. And yeah, there's no real association. He doesn't really have like a mentor. Again, his grandfather kind of introduces him to the computer and he'll program it on his lap, but nothing about Linus's life, again, being Finnish, the children of journalists, communists, says that this is the man that should create the most successful software project in the world.
Right.
And yet he does. And so I think that's a really cool example of like greatness really can come from anywhere. And
yeah,
it really levels the playing field, this world we're in these days, which is cool.
Yeah, I think there's a few pieces here that I also felt was really interesting. I didn't know much about Swedish immigrant subculture in Finland. He's actually part of this, right? So his family, also Torvalds is not a common name. Like all the Torvalds are related. And it's funny, I have this in common, which is like all the Toupses are the same thing. Like there was a made up name in the in South Louisiana in the 1700s, and so like every Toups is related. Every one of us came from South Louisiana because there's a name change on a marriage certificate. And it's weird because it's a Cajun name, but it doesn't sound like Boudreaux or Thibodeau or all the other names that you would think of down there. And Torvalds apparently is the same thing. Like Torvalds is like this kind of like meaningless obfuscation of a name.
It was like his dad's first name or something.
Yes, yeah.
Torvald.
But they added an S to the end, and so therefore, the other thing that I thought was interesting is, his grandfather is a professor, and seemed to be an amazing inspiration as far as him diving into what I would call, and again, this is like Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, I've talked about this in the past, called autotelic pursuits, or pursuing something for its intrinsic value. Torvalds was encouraged to sit down with him and use this computer that he had in his office. And his grandfather passes away when he's young, and he inherits the computer. It was like an obvious thing. Like they were like, of course, because they didn't have much money. Computers were incredibly expensive. And of course, as soon as you want to start doing more interesting things than writing, the classic hello for loop in BASIC, he learned how to do assembly programming because that gave you the instruction set of the CPU. And so, even though Torvalds like talks about just for fun and playing around, he was also deeply interested in how things worked, right? And he actually reminisces on the fact that you could reason about a VIC-20. You could actually like take it apart. You could read through the technical diagrams and like understand the memory and the CPU instruction sets and all these things. And so if he could imagine it, he could actually build it. And so some of the first stuff he'd buy is like an EEPROM programmer, so he could put custom stuff and then like hook it back into the computer. Not trivial things that a teenager would be doing, and I think really set him apart. Yeah,
I feel that way. One thing I think is neat about our field, but I also don't love, is that it can you're at a disadvantage if you discover it later in life. Nathan, we're similar in that way. I didn't really discover programming until college. You were kind of similar, or?
So it's funny. I didn't have faith in myself, so I naturally gravitated to it. And my moment with this was, I used to build computers with my dad. Like he'd just make a gaming computer, he'd play some of these like late 90s kind of things, but he would be like, I remember I learned about how to assemble computers, I didn't know anything about programming at the time, but I knew that like you could build computers. I knew what a CPU and RAM and all these things were. When I was in high school, I took an elective for a computer programming class, and normally those are pretty watered down and not that interesting.
Sure.
I feel very lucky. I had a retired Texas Instruments software engineer who kind of just wanted to continue working, and so he just taught the computer science class at our high school, and that taught me how to think programmatically. We weren't doing anything special. We were programming in BASIC, but we were programming non-trivial programs. Like I had to make a Pac-Man clone, and we did some text interactive stuff, but we actually did some graphical programming as well. And it was Visual Basic, so it's not just like the old terminal stuff. And it's funny because like I made an easy A in that class. I loved that class, and they actually sent me to Rally, which is like there's academic competitions, mathematics, in science. I was sent from my school to Rally in computer programming and got third in the state.
Nice.
And was like, oh yeah, but I'm not that smart. Like I never even thought maybe I should go into computer science. Like it did not cross my mind. Like you don't understand. I was like, I want to go into physics. I'm a creative person. Like I have all this like artistic stuff that I want to do. I know the kids who are good at computer programming. I'm not that. Like I really just wrote it off. And it took me a long time to come around and be like, actually, I love programming, and programming is amazing, and I should give myself permission. Anyway, yeah.
Well, no, because I mean, you got a jump start on it even earlier than I did. Mm-hmm. Mine was college, and I was a business student, and it was taking a Microsoft Excel class and just seeing the if formula, and that fascinated me, that the value in one cell could determine the value in another cell, and that kind of led me down a path to ultimately getting a CS minor in college, and then getting my master's degree from Georgia Tech.
That's so cool.
Yeah, but I do run into people who have been programming since they were like 10, like Linus here. And I do I think this industry is still very friendly to people like you or I who really get a start in it in college or later in their life. But sometimes you'll meet people who are just like have been doing it for a long time. Several of our junior engineers at my new company have been programming for a long time.
I have a junior engineer who, he started Python at 9. He read, I think it was like Python, the hard parts or something. He started working on it with his father. And like he'll have opinions on AVL trees or something. And you're like, oh, yeah, cool. Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, if there's any like 10-year-olds listening to this podcast, it's always funny. I have to mark on YouTube when I publish these things. They say, is it for kids? And I'm always like, it's not for kids, right. But I doubt that our primary audience is children. Yeah, so if there's any 10-year-olds out there listening, like, good on you. You could be the next Linus Torvalds. So he... another thing I found interesting about him when kind of talking about his upbringing, and he mentions this other times in the book, is that he is not very nostalgic, which I don't relate to. I'm a very kind of nostalgic guy. I like having mementos from the past or reflecting on, different experiences. But he mentions at one point after he develops Linux, it was common back then, still is, right, for big open source projects to kind of like set up a way to receive donations, right, to keep the project going. But he just kind of felt like, he's like, I don't really need money. Like, I've got my apartment, I've got enough money to buy pizza and beer. What else do I need? And so he requested and said postcards. He thought it'd be fun to get postcards from all over the world of people who are using Linux. And he got like hundreds of postcards near the beginning of the project. And his co-author, David Diamond, asked him, like, where are the postcards now? He's like, I don't know. I lost them. Right. And he's just like, and that was so foreign to me, because like I would have kept those and cherished those and probably turned into a big collage or something. And
I'm not nostalgic at all either. So I have this in common. And I've actually had to become more sensitive to this because our daughter is very sentimental about things. Mm-hmm. And so my wife and I, who neither one of us are sentimental or nostalgic, we've had to make space for that. And I have a lot of empathy for that, where I think I didn't really appreciate it, never really thought about it much. And obviously Torvalds is in like another stratosphere than I am, but I actually identified with that because I'm like, oh yeah, I guess it would have been nice to keep this kind of cool thing. But like we're down in Costa Rica and we brought, two duffel bags and a couple suitcases of like stuff, and everything else is in storage. And I was like, when we were leaving, I was like, I want to get rid of as much as humanly possible.
Yeah.
And I think for a lot of folks, that would be like one of the reasons they wouldn't move to a new country.
Oh, yeah,
because
yeah.
you'd lose a lot of things. Yeah.
No, I still keep on my desk. I have a special like silver dollar that someone from my church gave me when I became an Eagle Scout. And
oh wow, see, that's cool.
Yeah.
I mean, I appreciate that. I never would have done that. I would have been like, oh yeah, it's in some junk drawer somewhere. I don't.
Yeah, exactly. Like, sweet, $1. I'm gonna go buy a soda.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm gonna spend this.
So I mean, yeah, maybe now's a good time to talk about why does he build Linux?
Yeah. So
I mean, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, a couple things. Number one, he was really interested in 386 PCs. So I guess to give a little computer history, right? There's the VIC-20, there's the Sinclair QL, which is that was the first computer he saved up for. These were on hardware architectures that are before the PC clone. The PC clone revolution kind of like took the world by storm. And what was interesting is that PC clones basically had Microsoft software that would run on it, or very expensive commercial software that would run on it. And he wanted to port, a Unix type clone onto an architecture that he was interested in. It was what he could afford. He like bought this I think he financed actually this like 386 PC like kind of decked out. And I think this was kind of the interesting thing, is that he was targeting an architecture. It was not portable in the classic sense, right? You could not run Linux on any of the old computers he grew up on, or in the other architectures. He was building it specifically for this Intel, or PC clone type operating system. And
he initially built like a terminal emulator. Like
yes.
He's just trying to be able to log on to, I believe, the university's internet.
Yep.
I don't remember exactly what happens, but he gets to a point with his terminal emulator where he says he doesn't even remember exactly what it was, but he kind of decides like, okay, it's got to be an operating system now. Like I really am reaching the points where I need to kind of fundamentally redo how all of this works. I don't remember if he says exactly what caused that.
Well, and the cool part was that you see him appreciate Unix philosophy, right? Like, so he talks about this. He goes, hey, look, there's a bunch of syscalls. There's like 6 syscalls that you really care about, right? There's this like open, read, write, and there's a few others. And he basically is just like, kind of pontificates on the beauty of it. And I think any of us who've learned about Unix philosophy have kind of been like, wow, this is incredibly powerful. Like Dennis Ritchie and Ken Thompson like really did something special here when they looked at what was going on. And again, we got some of that through the Kernahan interviews and Unix: A History and a Memoir.
I was about to say, this book kind of functions as like an unofficial sequel to Unix: A History and a Memoir.
And what's interesting too, though, is that like, I think there's a contentious relationship, because Linux is, so there's this like other philosophy here, which is, for instance, Ken Thompson is not a Linux user directly. He's not like anti-Linux, but he personally likes more of the BSD variants of Unix, is kind of closer philosophically. Linux is kind of like, there's this book we probably will read at some point called the Cathedral and the Bazaar.
Yes, it's mentioned in this book.
It's mentioned in this book as well, right? Which is this idea that like there's the cathedral, which is like sort of these, monks go off and pontificate about the universe, and they come out and reveal, some beautifully architected software. But you kind of are stuck to this like dev cycle that fits the sort of the order or whatever. Where the bazaar is this like madhouse where all the stuff's going on, and there's these emergent properties, like a marketplace exists because all of these self-interested vendors are kind of there. And of course, if you're talking about like which one's more effective at like moving money around, the marketplace is going to be better than some sort of centrally managed thing. And that's what Linux kind of embraced, the sort of bazaar, this madhouse where no one's really in control, but there might be some sort of natural control patterns. And I think what's interesting is that Linux emerged at a time that was the creative Minix talks about this. He took some ideas in Linux that were considered obsolete. And there's this whole piece that I did not have appreciation of, which is a monolith versus a microkernel architecture. And it was considered passé to have a monolithic kernel. And Linus was the defender of the monolithic kernel. He goes, hey, look, yes, if the microkernel architecture is the idea that all these little, like the kernel does as little as possible. Almost everything lives in userland, but there's all these like interop between parts of the system. And GNU Herd is actually a microkernel architecture that the GNU project was trying to push, but never was able to ship. I mean, to kind of talk about this with Richard Stallman, Minix was a microkernel architecture. There's a bunch of other tools that were doing this, and it was considered by the academia obviously correct, right? Even later gets into a conversation he has with Steve Jobs, which again, another inflection point where he's like, yeah, but not for me. Where Steve Jobs is basically like, there's two players, there's Microsoft, there's Apple. We're going to take over the market. You better be with us. Kind of like, very Steve Jobsian ultimatum. And he's like, yeah, but your architecture sucks. And he like talks to the kernel architecture for the mock kernel, and they just don't agree on things. And so
he also just doesn't care. Like he says,
no.
He says Steve Jobs found it like baffling that I did not care about increasing Mac OS's market share.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
and I will say, while Torvalds is not a ideological communist, I do think he probably, and I've said this in the past, I think Karl Marx was wrong in his applications of how he wants to solve problems. But I do think that Karl Marx was correct in his critique of power. And I think he's correct in his critique of the intrinsic motivations that people might have. And I think that Torvalds absolutely sort of internalized this idea that I don't have to be impressed with powerful people. I can actually look at why they have power and go, is this in alignment with my philosophy or not? And
right.
Really get down to what makes Steve Jobs powerful? And he actually said he came away from it being like, Steve Jobs is a very interesting person. Like he didn't, he wasn't like, oh, he's a bozo, I hate this guy. He was just like, no, he wants to increase market share and, return value to investors. And I'm not interested in that.
But that's what makes Torvalds so interesting is I think so many people in this industry, even rank and file employees, if you ask what their philosophy is the pursuit of power, whether that comes from higher positions, association with power, more money. And so Torvalds, what makes him so interesting is that like at no point in this journey does that even kind of come across as something that's important to him. Like, oh, what I want is power or prestige. Right. Now he does say some things. He's like, he likes praise. He says he found it very rewarding that as he worked on Linux, people were telling him how great it was and what a genius he was, right? He is not opposed to money whatsoever, right? He is offered, he goes, his first job is working at Transmeta, which was doing like very like secretive, computer processor stuff. But he has also offered just money in stock in Red Hat. They just give it to him. Hey, thanks for creating our whole business for us, right? And then and then that IPOs and he gets like $20 million off of it. He has no moral qualms about this. It does not prompt any reckoning with his philosophy. Oh no, I used to be, the whatever leader of the free open source movement, and now I'm rich. He doesn't care. Like to him, it's just because I think again that encapsulates so much of the book. Like he's just doing this for fun. He's just asking himself like, what would be interesting things to work on? And I don't know, like I think there's something like weirdly noble about that.
Oh, it's amazing actually. And I think that it's proof that if you don't compromise on your core principles, there is a path, right? So I think a lot of times I go, oh, well, you can be ideological, but you're going to be broke your whole life or, this or that. But he actually shows that if you insist on doing exceptional engineering, and exceptional engineering as judged by other engineers, right? All of his power came from the fact that people appreciated his approach to doing an implementation of POSIX compliant Unix philosophy. And that while the general population has no idea any of the words that just came out of my mouth, it is the underpinnings of if you have a fundamentally sound foundation of operating systems, then you can build incredible things on top of it. And look at every tech company that's a $1 trillion plus valuation now, 100% operates on Linux. And it's sort of just like considered, of course I am, right? Like nobody even thinks twice about it because they can rely on it. It solves the fundamental problems. They can abstract on top of it. I mean, most people, the closest thing they get to an operating system now is like maybe a Kubernetes orchestration layer. And you're not really deploying Linux anymore. And he even talks about this in the book. Back in 2001, he goes, no one wants to think about operating systems. He's like, nobody even wants to have a conversation about operating systems. And I think this was like, maybe we could get into sort of predictions, because he actually nails some predictions, but he also like has pretty big misses on some others. And he says this with a grain of salt. He goes, I'm awful at predicting the future. So like, take this with a grain of salt. But there's like a few things that I think he thought were obvious that didn't turn out to be true. And then there's a couple of things that I think are probably beyond his wildest dreams. Because we have to remember, in 2001, Android did not exist. Right? This idea that Linux would be the operating system of smartphones for majority of the world. And I say this is like, I'm a longtime iPhone user, but I guess Unix won, right? Because iPhones are using a variant of the BSD, right? It's using the Mach kernel. And then 82% of market share is Android, which is running on Linux, which is nuts, right? And almost no one thinks about Linux being the core of Android, right? Android is basically just, it's my Android smartphone. But that's part of it. The other one is that like, he already saw the writing on the wall that like all the big companies were switching to using Linux as a server infrastructure. And I think it's like over 96%. I was like doing some statistical research recently. Over 96% of web servers on the internet are Linux. I would imagine that it probably at least 3% of the rest of it is some form of BSD, and then like Windows and the other ones are probably some small percentage. But I don't actually know. Yeah.
My company is one of those with a Windows server. We are migrating off of it, but the DNA of my current company is LinkedIn. That's where the founder is from, and where he got his first engineers were his coworkers at LinkedIn, which is a Microsoft company. And so it's funny, just some of the like original code that we're kind of migrating off of. I'm like, what is this? I'm like, is it Windows? Are we on a Windows server?
Is this C# that
no, but it's not C#. Java. The backend's all in Java.
Interesting. Java on Windows. Wow.
I know.
Why?
I too found this very interesting.
Oh man, are y'all using IIS for web server stuff? Do you know? Or
I don't know. I just was playing around in it just a bit. Yeah, but I did notice that we're doing like some scripting. There's a point in our GitHub action deploy where we do some manual scripting, and I was looking, like, I'm not familiar. Like, what is this scripting language? I'm like, this is Windows. Like, we're deploying, and we're on Azure. We're moving to AWS. But anyhow, so that's we're one of the 1%.
Yeah, no, and it's funny. I actually had one startup I almost went to, and then went a step back right before I joined, and then another one that we acquired. They were a big .NET C# shop, and of course a lot of those folks are deep into Azure, deep into Windows, especially if you're on an outdated version of .NET. And so I was like, oh man, I had spent my entire career avoiding Windows and I had to like deal with it for a little while. And of course I was like, let's get on to containers, let's get on to Linux. That was like a big part of what I was pushing for platform engineering.
So you talk about, Linux is kind of eating the world. But at the same time has not really made any progress as a desktop computer.
Yeah, so I guess there's two big predictions in this book that I think were way off, right? Number one, every year it became a trope that the Linux community was like, this is the year of the desktop. It hasn't come true, and I think it's just because like I think that, and I think maybe this has started from leadership too. Linus Torvalds talked about this very early on. The reason he was able to get so many people involved is because he was able to delegate parts of the system he didn't really want to think about.
Yeah, and I want to quote from him here, just because I did love it. He said, he talks about being lazy.
Yes. He's like the master of strategic laziness, honestly. And
he basically says, much of Linux's success can be attributed to my own personality flaws. 1, I'm lazy, and 2, I like to get credit for the work of others. Because you're right, like that's how Linux is able to develop so much, is that he says he's like, there were some things I didn't like. Like I didn't love a lot of like the user level code. So I just waited until someone showed an interest in it, and then I let them kind of take it over. He does that with lots and lots of Linux. He just kind of waits for leaders to emerge, and then goes with that. And that kind of goes into his philosophy about being trustworthy. He says, people trust me, but the only reason they do is that so far I've been trustworthy. And it's like you said, Nathan, like one day Linus might completely lose it and maybe we'll fork Linux. And then, that's kind of the end of Linus's involvement in it. But he's demonstrated himself to be a trustworthy and capable and leader so far. So,
yeah.
I think there's a lot of lessons for us in our careers. Like the best way to gain authority and, political capital in an organization, be trustworthy, deliver results.
And I'll say something that the book doesn't bring up. So he purposefully didn't work at any Linux corporations. Yes. So he, Red Hat wanted him, SUSE, all these other like Linux distros and stuff really wanted him to work there. And he always turned it down because he didn't want to pick favorites, right? He didn't want one. He also didn't want the mixing of concerns of commercial interests for that entity to influence what he decided was important on Linux. Which I thought was really cool. So he went and worked at a CPU, processor hardware company. Just 6 years later, though, and I think this is good, important context. In 2007, right? So this is 2 years after Git comes to be. The Linux Foundation decides the Linux Foundation transitions Linus Torvalds to be salaried, and they've funded this foundation with like several $1 million a year to pay for all the infrastructure that they need to run Linux full time. And Linus Torvalds becomes a full-time maintainer as paid for by the foundation. And the foundation, of course, has sponsors. And like to this day, right, Microsoft, who considered Linux a virus at the time that this book was written, is now a platinum sponsor and one of the largest contributors to Linux. And so, there's now this, I don't think he was even predicting it in 2001. There's this path in which Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, all of these companies contribute to the Linux Foundation, and that funds him working on this full time and just thinking about governance and all the other stuff. And so there's a maturity arc that took them there. And then, of course, ever since, he's still the primary contributor. I think I was reading that he still contributes something up to like 2% of changes, which is huge because it's a multi-million line code base, right, at this point. And he's also gone off and done other interesting things, right? He Bitwarden, which is the version control system that they were using, ended up having some licensing changes or something. He ends up writing the foundations of Git in a very short window, and I think from like in the course of like 3 or 4 months, creates Git and migrates Linux over to Git. All within the same year, like less than half of a year, which is nuts. And now it's ubiquitous. I mean, almost everybody uses Git for everything. And the other thing that I think is interesting is that he's also like really into scuba diving. This is like again, they don't bring this up in the book, but I knew this because my father's into scuba diving, and he hated the scuba diving software. So like one of the best pieces of scuba dive logging and tracking software was written by Linus Torvalds. So of course it's just like this like scuba diving stuff that you can hook into all the dive computers and then like takes all the telemetry and lets you keep track of stuff. And yeah, he just like went off and wrote some code and made it happen. And it's those quick turnarounds. And then of course he's built communities around those 3 things. Like if you're into the scuba diving community, he's got awesome software. If you're into version control, or if you're into operating systems, it's just like he's living his dream, solving fun problems.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think another thing he was kind of prescient about and really saw coming is that he talks about that philosophy of everything evolves from survival to social order to fun. It's funny, even though he's talking about Linux as like that's a fun thing he's doing and it's fun for him, I see it a little more in the grander evolution of computing as falling a bit more in the social order.
Yep.
Chunk of the progression. He's bringing this ability to the software engineering world to build faster, to build with a reliable distribution of Unix. And like he says, like eventually you get to the point where he's like, well, no one really wants to talk about operating systems because it's not fun. It's about it's more kind of about social order. I think if you look at a lot of the tech companies that have become giants since then, they really are focused on fun. Like you have Facebook,
Right.
Twitter, TikTok. I even think something like Airbnb is a little more about fun than necessarily social order. And so I think that's not something you saw as much when this book was written in 2001. Like how many of the internet companies that came out and became really big back then were about fun so much? Not really, because your giants out of that time are like Apple, Amazon, Google, a little more practical.
So I will
but
say
even
that
then, after that, Apple pivots to making the iPod and the iPhone, and these I would say are more classically fun than like an Apple than a Mac.
Yeah, this is interesting too, because I think this gets us into a deeper question of again the attention economy and what. Yeah, again, this is going to get a little bit political, I guess, but when Apple makes a piece of hardware, or when a computer company makes a computer, or you let's say you're into painting and you buy paints or paintbrushes, right? When I exchange money for those things, there's value that comes out of this, right? And the company extracts that value, and the profit that comes from that is what sustains them and continues perspective on the world. Facebook, on the other hand, I'm a lot more skeptical of, because yes, they're exploiting the desire for fun, but what they're doing is they're harvesting my attention.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I think that there can be a very parasitic relationship there. I'm not saying that they're now, if you are embedded with a community so that your children have a more fulfilling, musical life or something, right? Or you're able to if you're cultivating the connections between other humans, I do think that is a good exchange of value, right? But if I find myself using Facebook to get my news information and I get riled up and my cortisol levels go up.
Yeah.
I think it's an extraction, because they're basically taking some lizard brain stuff and then feeding me ads and trying to manipulate my behavior. And I'm concerned by that, right? I think that's in Linus Torvalds, while it's viral that Linux grew, there's no predatory part. There's no hey, by the way, here's your first fix, and then now you
hooked on Linux.
Hooked on Linux. And I think the AI stuff's doing this too, right? So for instance, I'm using Claude increasingly for stuff, and I'm I find it that I'm using it for all kinds of things, and I'm like, okay, am I using these in the constraints that it's actually a value multiplier, or is it manipulating my behavior? Is it making it so that I want to just get more out of it? And I think that we have to be really careful with where we go. Entertainment exploitation, right? Or something like that.
No, I have such a mixed relationship with it all. I kind of have somewhat of a moral opposition to short form video content. I watch the occasional YouTube short, but I don't have TikTok installed on my phone. And I never really scroll shorts. It's if something pops up my feed, I'm like, oh, this particular thing looks interesting, and I'll watch it. And still, I'm kind of a purist about I can't stand vertical video, so I think I've always been turned off from it for that. As far as Facebook goes, I kind of just quit using it after around the last election. It wasn't a principled decision, I'm done with this platform, but I just I just kind of started using it less and less. And then when I quit using it, I just didn't notice. And I was and I didn't know my life wasn't worse off for it. I will say my life has improved dramatically by not knowing the political opinions of any of my friends. I like that a lot. But I also miss I have a lot of friends from high school, and I'd love to see what they're up to, but I just kind of don't want to log into Facebook and wade through all that mess. And so I don't know, maybe Facebook will make a version one day where you don't have to see any of the political stuff.
I doubt it. I mean, it's very
honestly,
lucrative, right?
Exactly.
It's lucrative. It's lucrative for them to make you spend more time on the platform than you intended. And to me, that's I would call those are called dark patterns. The idea is if I say, you know what, I'm just going to go catch up real quick, and then I realize 30 minutes later I'm still on the platform, and that was not my intent. That's a dark pattern. And now, and what I would rather do, right? And again, if we think about the entertainment now, if you are going, how does this thing work? And you take it apart, and then you happen to find yourself spending an hour, 2 hours really diving into something, that's a good use of exploratory, focus time lost, because you came out of that and you're like, you probably understand something deeper about the world than you did when you started.
The one I'm
so,
absolutely conflicted on is Twitter, because I spend way too much time on Twitter. And if you follow me on the podcast, you're like, Carter, you don't ever tweet anything. I have an anonymous account, and that's where I spend way too much time. And I get like I try not to follow anyone who's just like riling me up or anything like that. But like on the one hand, I'm like, maybe I shouldn't be so connected to the world. On the other hand, I find so many interesting ideas on Twitter, you know, whether that's technical or philosophical or sometimes political. And like, I'll bookmark things throughout the day. And then like, I almost have like a Twitter roundup with my wife every night where I'll like read them with her and be like, I thought this was really interesting, or this was really funny. And so like, on the one hand, like Twitter is an awful toxic cesspool. On the other hand, I do frequently find myself engaging with very interesting people, and very interesting ideas there. And so that's the one I haven't quite been able to parse out. Like, is this destroying my life or is it making it better? Maybe a little of both.
Yeah. It actually reminds me, you know, they're talking about the AI stuff where you've probably seen that meme where it's like this pleasant face that you're looking at with this like big weird spaghetti monster looking thing in the background. I feel like social media and these large language models are both that, right? I think that they're tapping into something deeper in what it means to be human that we're not all quite sure of. And I think, yes, obviously you're getting value out of it, which is why you keep using it. But you're also, it's probably also reinforcing some things that are not as healthy, whether we want to admit it or not. And I think that that's like, I saw that in myself, which was that I stepped away from those social media platforms because I didn't like who I was. And I think I'm worse than a lot of people in that, like, I was one of those, like, I think there's that XKCD where it says someone's wrong on the internet, right? Like you know, like I was that person. I went through this like phase where, you know, I was like, oh, this person's wrong and I got to explain stuff. And I was like, I'd come away from it being like, ugh, like just, this is the worst. And so when I quit, I realized that my baseline contentment increased and I had more time to work on weird little interesting projects that I wanted to work on. So yeah.
Well, I mean, maybe let's wrap up here. And any final thoughts about Linus and his story? You know, by nature of the podcast, we can't talk about everything.
One other error, this one, I know we can't talk about everything. This one that really surprised me, and I think he was way off on. He talks about the failures of DVD encryption. And they, you know, all these people, and I was one of these people, I had no money back in early 2000s. And so I was one who was using, you know, I was pirating software and you know, quote unquote, stealing music. And it was okay. I was like this broke college student and I knew how to like use, you know, LimeWire and Napster and cracking software. But he basically was like, hey, all these DRM measures, I don't think he called it DRM. I don't know if it was called that back then, but all these like encryption measures, they're going to inevitably fail. That there's no way to get around it. Like hackers are going to figure out how to, you know, do this stuff. But I don't think he realized that there was a way to get around it, which was that browser makers and streaming services would rise up so that you just pay a subscription to get access to it enough, and that most people are so lazy that they're not going to go out and like actively pirate stuff if they can just like pay $15 a month. And, you know, you basically get to watch a movie that doesn't have a save button. That's, you know, that's like I think the Cory Doctorow, you know, method of talking about DRM. And, you know, so the whole business model of Spotify, Netflix, all these other things, I don't think was like, no one had wrapped their heads around that. And so in some ways, DRM absolutely won, right? You have to put an incredible amount of effort to have a local catalog of music and movies.
Yeah, and I think that's something, it doesn't surprise me that Linus thought that way, and because I see that a lot with kind of people who are like really into Linux. Like one of my favorite jokes is like, Linux is only free if you value your time at zero. And I also know like a couple of years ago, Nintendo released like a little Super Nintendo console, right? And you know, you can plug your controller into it, and it came preloaded with like 40 games or whatever. I bought it. I think it was like $60 or something, because I love the Super Nintendo. And all anyone said online is like, why would you do that when you could just set up a Raspberry Pi? And it's just kind of like, because for you, setting up a Raspberry Pi is like a fun project, but for so many people, that is a ridiculous hurdle to clear, right? And I saw it was like what's the equivalent of The Onion, but for tech? I don't remember what that website is. But anyhow, they had an article back then that was like, why would you buy the new Super Nintendo when you instead you could buy a Raspberry Pi and never shut up about it? And
Yeah. That was funny. That was me too, though, because I was like, "Oh yeah, RetroPie."
yeah.
I have,
and I set up a RetroPie. It was a fun project, but like so many
but it's
people
not
just
for
want
most
to buy
people.
they just want to buy the thing off the shelf and it works.
Right.
And I'm that way with like pirating music or movies or whatever. Like I'm happy to pay the $15 a month and look, it's the same, the app's on my phone, it's on my computer, it's on my Apple
Right.
TV, and it just works. I'm the same way with like, I pay for YouTube Premium. I know there's
Me
other
too.
ways around it, but like, I like that it's just, I get ad-free stuff on every platform I use YouTube on. And so Linus, who obviously, this is the man who said, oh, wow, all the scuba diving software sucks, I'll write my own. I think maybe he underestimated the, how much convenience factors in for the average consumer.
Yeah. I think it's the same reason that Linux on the desktop still hasn't seen its heyday.
Yeah.
Is that for the massive majority of the population, like, no one is using Android. I should say most of the billions of people using Android are not using it because of Linux. They're using it because Linux is just invisible, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And the computing part of a smartphone is invisible too, right? The smartphone runs circles around everybody's computer back in the 90s that they paid thousands of dollars for. And yet it's invisible largely, right? It's just a touch screen that happens to give you some apps that connect to the internet, and that's all they really care about. And yeah, which he predicted this. And that was the interesting thing. He goes, no one wants to think about operating systems. No one wants to think about computers. It's funny to see those two little factoids projected out and being like, yeah, that's absolutely correct. Like nobody wants to think about these things.
And I think that shows a good maturity of worldview, because I think we have a tendency to think whatever fascinates us must also fascinate other people. And so I think that's interesting that despite operating systems clearly being fascinating to him, he says, you know what, at the end of the day, people don't really care about this. It's a means to an end. I think that shows, that's an interesting thought pattern there.
Last topic before we get into our closing stuff, which is, and this is really quick, and I'm not doing it enough justice, but I have to do it, which is that he does spend a little bit of time talking about Richard Stallman and the Free Software Foundation and his sort of like pragmatic approach versus like the purists' approach to free software. And I think I fall in the camp of Linus Torvalds here. I appreciate that the Richard Stallmans and the Free Software Foundations of the world exist, but I think that most people don't want to be preached at about why all of this stuff happens. And I think Linux took a really pragmatic approach and used the GPL v2, which basically said, hey, any changes you make to the operating system have to be shared to the public, like derivative works. And so it gave this sort of like viral license where you're not restricted from using it, but if you make changes to it and distribute that code, you also have to make the source code for that available. And I think that's really cool. Really cool.
Yeah, he says, because that's a question he has, like, should people be able to charge for Linux? And that's ultimately what it comes down. It's like, yes, you can charge as much as you want for Linux if there's a market for it, but whatever changes you make, you have to contribute back to the foundation. Right. Because he said something that prompted him to let people charge is he was getting people saying like it was like college students at Linux meetups, and like people were asking like, can I charge $50 for a floppy disk of Linux just to cover my time in getting it set up on the disk and on their computer? And Linus kind of thinking like, well, is that so bad? And then but that kind of again plays into Linus's very practical philosophy, and that's, I think, something, if you didn't know a ton about Linus before reading this book, would surprise you, because again, he's not an ideologue, and he's not preaching at you. He's very practical, but again, what comes across in this book, it's just for fun. He's just doing what he thinks is fun, what he finds fulfilling, and that kind of naturally led him to a lot of success. And it also made a lot of those decisions easier for him because he wasn't committed to some rigid ideology. He could just kind of ask what was pragmatic. And so, yeah, very, very interesting guy, a very admirable philosophy in a lot of ways. And, I think maybe now's a good time to talk about, having read about Linus and his philosophy and this journey, what changes is it going to prompt in us? So, I mean, what are you going to do differently, Nathan?
So I had a project that I'd been working on. I hadn't really touched it in like the last 3 years. And I think this has inspired me to share my work earlier. So I'll do this thing where I'll write some code, even if it's open source, and I put it out with a permissive license on GitHub. I didn't finish it. I also didn't like ask for community feedback. And so I think my goal here is to take some of my personal obsession projects, which are like silly little projects that I'm working on that have no practical purpose other than I think that they're interesting, and make sure that I share them with folks that I think might find it interesting. And so, yeah, and just see where it takes me. I mean, it could be that, 5 people care, but I think it would also be kind of fun to just show my work more aggressively. And so I did this. I actually started, I actually was doing some coding with Claude Code because I built the architecture for this thing. I built some of the stuff, and I built like a really bad, I wanted to make a UDP server. And so I'd never built a UDP server. I was like very interested in this. And mine was a terrible implementation of a custom UDP server from scratch. And I actually pair programmed with Claude Code, and it fixed some fundamental problems that I had run into and helped me build out a benchmarking and test suite. And it is like a over 5x improvement in performance than the one I had built, and it's actually provably, it's correct in its implementation. So I'll be sharing this soon, but it's yeah, I think I'm actually going to build a reference server and like put it up on the internet and like write a blog post about it. And this book inspired me to get this over the finish line.
Well, nice. Mine is somewhat of a cop out, but I do think I've been doing this lately. It's just I want to have more fun, and that has actually that was a decision I'd made like a month ago when I was looking for jobs. This company I wound up going with, like I had other offers on the table. In particular, I had one other offer, which not only did it pay more, but it just made a lot more sense, so to speak. Like I think as a career move, it might have been better. But every time I kept coming back to my current company, the ones I ultimately wound up going with, like I left every interview being like, I like these guys. Like this seems like a fun environment. Like this seems exciting. And even though, yeah, I think from like an on paper perspective, there are reasons it didn't make sense. Like the other one would have given me like a higher title. There was more money. It was more like AI focused. But I told my wife, I'm like, we have done the responsible thing almost like ruthlessly for the past 10 years or so. Maybe we just get to do the fun thing now. And, I'm only a month in and we'll see how it goes. But so far, I haven't regretted it once. And it has been fun. And I'm finding joy and fulfillment in my work that I haven't for literal years. And so I think as I continue to make career decisions, I need to not downplay the importance of fun. It worked out for Linus. Maybe it'll work out for me. We'll keep you posted. And, when Nathan and I are doing this podcast into our 60s, you'll know how it all played out.
How wild would that be?
Yeah. I was actually talking yesterday with a buddy how there is a reality where Book Overflow outlives the website Stack Overflow, and where new listeners, like if we're doing this 10 years from now, discover the podcast, not realizing that the name of the podcast is a pun on the website, which of course is an actual computing philosophy. Anyhow, well, who would you recommend the book to, Nathan?
So if you enjoyed Unix, A History and a Memoir, and you wanted to see a snapshot of what Linux was like in its creation the first 10 years, I think that this is a great book. There's no restriction to the audience, in my opinion. I think that if you're curious about the history of Linux and Linus's life straight from the horse's mouth, there's not a better book.
Yeah. I wrote Any Nerd Who Likes a Good Biography. I think
much more succinct. Yeah.
And I don't know if you're listening to this podcast, some of these books we talk about, you might think like, I don't know if I want to get into that. That sounds like a little heady or too much reading, but this is a light, breezy read. And especially if the kind of guy who likes biographies, like, this is great. And, really funny, really interesting, definitely worth the read.
I bought the physical copy, and it's actually in storage. So, I don't have it. So, but I will tell you, if you do a very basic amount of Google searching, there's an EPUB and PDF version of the book that you can find. So obviously you should support the book if you can. But in the spirit of open source, there are tools. And so I actually read this on Apple Books,
Nice.
app. That's what I imported it into. And
I'm a Kindle ride or die.
Yeah, I actually couldn't find the email address to send it to myself, so
interesting.
I just used I like opened the EPUB and it defaulted to Apple Books and it was fine.
Well, yeah, so we love the book. David Diamond, if you're listening, come on the podcast. Linus, especially you, if you're listening, come on the podcast, and we are going to we'll keep you updated. We can't promise anything, listeners, but we are intending to pull out a couple of stops and to call in some favors to see if we can't get in touch with Linus, because we would love to talk to him. So wish us luck in our quest. It'll be a great episode if it ever comes to be one day. And thanks for listening, everyone. Again, email us at contact@bookoverflow.io. Find me on Twitter at Carter Morgan. Find the podcast on Twitter at bookoverflowpod. Find Nathan with Functionally Imperative at functionallyimperatives.com. And keep listening, folks. We're excited for what's to come. We'll see you around.
Cool.